morning. Thank you, Mayor Becker. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
The Harrison Smith, or St. George AME Cemetery on Pollocktown Road, served black families in Lewes for about 100 years, from the earliest headstone set in 1848 through 1945, when the cemetery was closed. After then, a handful of additional interments took place. During those years, much of African American life was based around 3 black local historic churches. Families from all those churches made use of the cemetery, which was supported by the Beneficient Association. The Melson Funeral Home officiated many of those burials after 1934, when it first opened here in Lewes. Over time, records have been lost as to how many persons were buried in the cemetery or what the cemetery looked like. At one point, it was thought up to 82 persons were buried there. Then the number increased to 200 after older burial records were discovered. I would now like to ask Mark Chura of the Greater Lewes Foundation project manager, who oversaw the ground penetrating radar effort, to tell us what has been learned today.
Good morning, everyone. Let's go back, Heidi, to the previous slide. A lot of you may remember this wonderful hanger that was really marking that cemetery location for many, many years. That was actually a champion tree that was lost not that many years ago to lightning. One of 2 pieces on the, one of 2 hackberries on the property. One still remains. I want to give a little bit of background following on comments made about the work that was done. This project was done, it was initiated to better understand the history of the cemetery and the people within it. We hired Ed Otter Incorporated. They were contracted to map the cemetery, both above ground and below ground. And that started at the beginning of this year. The ground penetrating radar work was conducted by Horsley Architectural Prospection LLC. Tim Horsley is a professor out of Illinois, but he is nationally renowned for his work with historic cemeteries. So we had a really good team working on it. Go to the next slide. A little bit of background on the cemetery. I think, as many of you know, St. George's AME Cemetery is small. This is a half-acre parcel, only just slightly over a half-acre off of Pilottown Road. Back in 1971, a history of St. George's AME Cemetery was prepared by Pastor Luther L. Walker Jr. That document claims that the AME meetings in Lewes were begun by Bishop Richard Allen, Philadelphia. And as I think many of you know, Richard Allen founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1794 and was elected its first bishop in 1816. And again, as many of you know, Bishop Allen was born in slavery in Kent County, Delaware, but he managed to buy his own freedom. Focusing on the cemetery now, the deed history of this cemetery traces back to Peter Lewes. Lands records indicate that Peter Lewes owned a parcel along Lewes Creek prior to 1831. 30 years later, he acquired an additional 2-acre parcel, which at that time was listed to be adjoining the grave lot with a dwelling and meeting house. So this land, the cemetery, can be traced back can be traced to this present-day parcel, which is located northwest of the present-day cemetery. A lot of that history back in the early 1800s is murky. It's unrecorded. There are graves noted there from the 1840s, but there's a lot of history still unknown and still being researched. But what we were able to find, go ahead to the next slide. I'm going to go through in these next couple slides and show you the above ground and then what was found in the ground penetrating radar. What this really marks, and it's familiar to any of you who've been by the site, or walk the site, it's really dominated by a number of small concrete square stones. All of those were numbered. A lot of those numbers were lost, so you can't read them, but most you can kind of figure them out. There's, as was mentioned, a lot of work being done now to reconstruct who was there. Pam Dawnel have been doing work, the Lewes Historical Society has been doing work, Ed Otter was doing work as part of their task, their assignment. So there's still a lot to be learned and a lot of work going on to learn what was there. Go ahead. This is just a list of some of the names. This came out of the Ed Otter report. Again, one of several sources really documenting and going back and figuring out just who was interned in the cemetery and when. So now what I want to do is go ahead to the next slide. Let's talk a little bit about the ground penetrating radar. We went from 80 to 200, and what you see here is the work that was done, and I'm just going to point it out. I don't have a pointer. And it was actually pretty remarkable. What you see here, these areas here are some small stands of shrubs toward the back of the property and there as well. But the rest of these areas are indicative of burials. And the color of that, I think, do we have another color slide? This is a little bit better. And the coloration denotes the depth of the grave. So there's some tables here that show the depths of the grave. But the cemetery is in really two portions. There's a western portion and then there's an eastern portion. On the western side, you can see it. You can see the quadrants there. There are 4 quadrants here that are divided by intersecting walkways. And each one of those quadrants, 3 of them have 8 rows of graves, 1 of them has 7. And then along the edge, you just notice the graves there too. There's additional graves that go right to the boundary line of the property. So this was really laid out as tightly as possible, compacting people, though, in a planned design for burials. So you have that section, and then there's a second section. And the second section is over in here. And again, if you've been to the cemetery, you'll recognize that change. You see some of the headstones are actually turned in a different direction. They're kind of running this way. And what we found is that what the consultant team found was that you have 2 rows of graves here, and then 2 additional rows with a center path, a trail, walkway leading from Pilottown Road all the way back into this area here. And then once you get back into this area here, there are no graves. So the sense is that, although it's not been fully documented, that is where the church was. So the feeling is that there was a church here. The footprint of that is suggested, based on the research, to be about 24 by 48. So the church structure could have been those dimensions, could have been shorter. But at least we know that that's the rough footprint for a structure to be there. And its access came from Pilottown Road down that path with graves on either side, and then this came a little bit later. So that's what we know. Now, there's still a lot that we don't know, but the ground penetrating radar really added to that. What's really remarkable when you look at all of those little ovals are the number of people who are actually there. This research revealed and documented that there are 453 probable burials on this site, 453, with an additional 35 possible burials identified just in this mapping. Now, when you assume that a small number of burials are undetectable, and that there are additional burials under these bushes that the radar couldn't get, the consultant team estimates that there could be as many as 550 burials in this 1/2 acre site. So this work has really kind of upped the game a little bit. There are a lot of people here. So there are a lot of stories here, and there's a lot of history here. And it just really reinforces the significance of this site for this area and for this region. So I think that's our Yeah, I think you're back on, so, thank you.